jewel of French and British aviation, designed to go faster than the speed of sound, is up in flames in Paris, France. How could an aircraft like the Concorde end up in such a precarious situation just like this? July 2000, parked at Paris preparing to fly to New York, Air France Flight 4590 is preparing for a 3-hour-long flight across the Atlantic. The aircraft being used for Flight 4590 is a nearly 25-year-old Paris-Charles de Gaulle Concorde registered as Foxtrot Bravo Tango Sierra Charlie. The Concorde is a supersonic passenger commercial airliner with joint development and production between the British and French governments. The Concorde was designed to carry 92 to 128 passengers and go faster than the speed of sound at Mach 1.8 to Mach 2.04 or at around 1,341 miles per hour or 2,158 kilometers per hour. Developed by France's Paris-Charles and Britain's BAC or British Aircraft Corporation, Concorde developed across the 1960s and 1970s before having its first flight on March 2, 1969 and being put into service on January 21, 1976 at British Airways and Air France. This particular Concorde was put into service on October 24, 1979. By July 2000, the plane had 11,989 total flight hours. Inside the cockpit were 3 pilots, with 54-year-old Captain Christian Marty as pilot flying, with 13,477 total flight hours, and 317 of them being on the Concorde. Next is 50-year-old First Officer Jean-Marc, with 10,035 total flight hours, and 2,698 of them being on the Concorde. Lastly, 58-year-old Flight Engineer Gilles Jardineau, with 12,532 flight hours, with 937 of them being on the Concorde. On board the aircraft, there are 9 crew members consisting of the 3 flight crew and 6 cabin crew members. With them were 109 passengers for a total of 189 occupants on board. Flight 4590 was chartered by a German cruising company as the passengers were heading to New York to board the MS Deutschland for a 16-day cruise to Manta, Ecuador. 1600 hours from the afternoon of July 25, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 is boarding its 109 occupants preparing for a 4.5-hour flight from Paris-Charles de Gaulle International Airport to New York's John F. Kennedy International. The plane requested to take off from runway 26 right, scheduled to take off at 16:30. At 16:07:22, Flight 4590 was given clearance to start up and leave their gate, with controllers giving Flight 4590 permission to taxi to runway 26 right only a few minutes later at 16:34:38. Flight 4590 began taxiing to runway 26 right, trailing behind Continental Airlines Flight 55, a DC-10 bound for Newark International Airport in Newark, New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from New York. Continental Flight 55 lined up on runway 26 right, the same runway as Flight 4590. Flight 55 took off at 16:38, but a small titanium strip, part of the DC-10's engine casing, was separated and ended up on the runway. Flight 55 took off as normal, with nobody noticing that a small strip was left on the runway as it took off. The DC-10 then proceeded with their flight, arriving at Newark like normal around 7 hours later. Back to Flight 4590, they were cleared to line up on runway 26 right at 16:40:02. They were given cleared to take off from runway 26 right only 2 minutes later at 16:42:17. At 16:42:31, Flight 4590 began their takeoff roll bound for New York. At 16:42:54, the plane passed 100 knots, with Flight 4590 passing the V1 threshold only 9 seconds later at 16:43:03. V1 speed is the threshold in which an aircraft can no longer abort and stop their takeoff safely without risking an overrun. However, only a few seconds after passing V1, Flight 4590 ran over the small strip of metal that was separated from the DC-10 that took off 5 minutes earlier. The Concorde, being a delta-winged plane designed to break the sound barrier, had no flaps or slats, which meant the plane had a higher takeoff speed. Flight 4590 was going fast enough that when it ran over the strip of metal from Flight 55, the tire was completely shredded. The shredded tire pieces were flung towards the underside of the left wing. None of the pieces hit the engine, but the pieces punctured the fuel tank in the left wing. The fuel leaking from the fuel tank was likely ignited by exposed wiring from the plane's gears due to the aforementioned ruptured tire. The amount of fuel that was gushing out the punctured fuel tank plus ignition from the cut exposed wire caused the fuel to ignite and burst into flames. The sudden gushing of fuel and severe fire under the left wing caused the engines 1 and 2 to surge and completely lose power, with engine 1 being able to mostly recover but engine 2 having completely failed. At 16:43:13, the pilot started rotating the aircraft, with the controller informing Flight 4590 of the fire and smoke trail coming from under the left wing. At 16:43:22, the engine fire alarm sounded, and the flight engineer shut down engine 2 in response. The aircraft climbed with flames trailing behind them as the plane reached 200 knots. By 16:43:30, the pilots attempted to retract the landing gear. The engine fire alarm turned on and off again until 16:43:58, where it stayed on until the end of the flight. At 16:43:56, the pilots confirmed that the landing gear had not retracted. By this point, engine 1 had also surged and completely failed, leading to Flight 4590 banking severely to the left. Pilots reduced the thrust on engines 3 to 4 in an attempt to level the plane, but since they were still low in airspeed, it led to the plane starting to stall. By 16:43:59, the ground proximity warning system started sounding off, with the pilots attempting to divert the plane to the nearby Paris-Le Bourget airport, but as the plane was low on speed, Flight 4590 lost control and started stalling and banking severely. Only a few seconds later, at 16:44:31, Flight 4590 crashed into the Hôtel Soleil Bleu Hotel in Gonesse, France, only 2 minutes after Flight 4590 started their takeoff roll. All 109 occupants aboard Flight 4590 were killed, with the crash being labeled as unsurvivable from investigators later on. The plane crashed into a hotel, and as a result, 4 staff members in the hotel were killed when the plane crashed. The explosion from Flight 4590 completely destroyed the building and caused a severe fire around the crash site, spreading towards the neighboring hotel. By 16:43, controllers informed the fire service near the airport that Flight 4590 had crashed near Gonesse, France. Firemen from the South Fire Station of Paris-Charles de Gaulle and Paris-Le Bourget began to head towards the crash site, with the fire crew from Le Bourget arriving 8 minutes later at 16:51. The fire was so severe that they were only able to limit it for the first 2 hours, with the fire being put under control around 3 hours after the crash occurred at 1900. On the ground, there were 8 people in the hotel, with 4 of them being killed and the other 4 sustaining injuries from the crash. The investigation was headed by France's Bureau of Korean Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, or BA for short, led by Chief Investigator Alain Boyard. The final report was released on the 16th of January 2002. In the report, the main cause of the crash was found to be the small strip of metal that fell from Continental Flight 55, which had taken off on the same runway as Flight 4590 only a few minutes prior. The strip of metal was not manufactured or installed in accordance with procedures, which led to the strip falling from the DC-10 on that very day. One of the main factors contributing to the crash was the rupturing of the tire of Flight 4590. As Concorde is a tailless delta-winged supersonic aircraft, the plane didn't have flaps or slats. As a result, the Concorde had a higher takeoff speed than other commercial aircraft. The increased speed meant that if the Concorde ran over something during takeoff, it would have a higher chance of rupturing the tires. The Concorde already had several incidents where a tire ruptured during takeoff, with several having incidents of a punctured fuel tank. Another factor which could have helped cause the crash was the fact that Flight 4590 was overloaded by 810 kilograms, or around 1790 pounds. The report concluded that the extra weight had negligible effects on the takeoff performance of Flight 4590. However, there are alternative theories suggesting that the extra weight shifted the plane's center of gravity towards the back of the plane, resulting in the pilots having less control of the plane. In handling the incident, the pilots rotated the plane too early, with the plane being 11 knots under the recommended takeoff speed. Add to that, the flight engineer had shut engine 2 when Flight 4590 was only 25 feet off the ground. But in standard protocol, they were supposed to shut the engine when the plane was stable at 400 feet. As a result, the plane had less thrust available to climb and gain altitude. Although from the BEA's report, the plane still likely would have crashed, as with the fire and structural damage being so severe that the plane would have been doomed to crash anyways. After the crash, the Concorde was rehauled with new safety modifications, securing the electrical wires and adding a Kevlar lining to fuel tanks to reduce the chance of any debris puncturing a fuel tank. However, even with the modifications, the crash of Flight 4590 marked the end of the Concorde era. as the Concorde stayed grounded until around November 2001, but with the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, passenger numbers dropped to low levels. Concorde was already extremely expensive to maintain, so with the drop in passenger numbers, high fuel costs and high maintenance, the Concorde was retired from service in 2003 with both British Airways and Air France. 5 years after the crash in March 2005, a criminal investigation was opened towards Continental Airlines for improper maintenance, as a piece of the plane's engine casing was improperly installed, leading to the piece falling on the runway. By March 2008, charges of manslaughter were put against Continental Airlines and 2 employees who worked on the DC-10 user Flight 55. Along with that, charges were laid against the head of the Concorde program in Aeropastial, Concorde's chief investigator, and the head of the DGAC, a French airline regulator, for allowing the Concorde to fly despite allegedly knowing the risk of the Concorde's fuel tanks being punctured. The trial later ended with Continental Airlines having to pay 200,000 euros in fines and 1 million euros to Air France. Continental was also ordered to pay 70% of the compensation costs to families, representing around 70 million euros, as Air France already paid 100 million euros in compensation. Continental was also held liable for the crash despite a French appeals court overruling the first trial. In the aftermath, monuments were erected in Gonesse, France at the site of the crash, and another monument being put up south of Charles de Gaulle Airport. Flight 4590 proved to be the beginning of the end of an era, as Concorde would never recover after Flight 4590, with high costs and low passenger numbers and the timing of the crash all leading to the Concorde being retired by 2003. Hey guys, sorry if my voice sounded raspy on chapter 1, I was recording this when I was sick. And speaking of recording this, I'm recording this quite literally the day before my finals, so that's why it's a little bit rushed, but well, I'm starting off my next episode already, so see ya. Bye!